All right, welcome back everybody to the Additive Snack Podcast. I'm your host, Fabian Alefeld, and today I am joined by someone who's been shaping the voice and the reality of the additive manufacturing community from behind the scenes and for quite some time, and that is Carolyn Schwaar, editor at All3DP.com. This is now the second time we have somebody from the AM media community on the show. And even though we oftentimes talk to the technology leaders that are really deep into the technology, I really do find it very valuable to zoom out and to talk to people like Carolyn, who maintain such a good overview and pulse on the additive manufacturing industry, including all its trends. And therefore today, we'll talk about many of those topics. We'll dive into current trends that she's seeing from the coverage that All3DP.com is focusing on. We'll talk about also that other target group of additive manufacturing, which is consumers and hobbyists, and how they sometimes very interestingly transition that hobby into their workplace and become leaders for additive manufacturing in that space. We'll also, I think, touch on tariffs. We'll talk about various different unique insights that Carolyn has. And therefore, without any further ado, Carolyn, welcome to Additive Snack.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
It's awesome to have you on the show. As I just mentioned, really excited to have those types of conversations. And before we dive into all of these topics, for someone who is not familiar with All3DP.com, what's that platform? What's it all about? What's the background?
Yeah, sure. All3DP magazine is an online magazine for both hobbyists and professionals. We are the largest magazine on the internet for that. We have about 1 million readers a month. And that spans consumers and professionals. And we started out in 2014 covering the hobby space. But as our readers have matured and moved from the hobby into professional, a lot of people taking their hobby into their workplace, our coverage has expanded, and now we have hundreds and thousands of readers who really tune into our All3DP Pro section, which is a separate homepage and a little bit different coverage covering additive manufacturing and all of those technologies.
Super interesting. I actually did not know you guys were the largest additive manufacturing outlet in the industry. So 1 million readers, that's impressive. I remember the last time that we talked, you also mentioned a company called Kraft Cloud. What is that all about, and how does that fit into the picture?
Yeah, Kraft Cloud is our sister company, our other side. They are a 3D printing service. Rather, they're a 3D printing marketplace where they have about 150 3D printing manufacturing partners. And it's a platform where you go to craftcloud.com and you upload your file, your digital file, and then you can pick from any of the manufacturers who provide a quote. And then you could pick based on price or location or that manufacturer's reviews on the site.
Interesting. So really a platform for contract manufacturers. Are the end users mainly, do you see large production contracts get funneled through Kraft Cloud, or is it more maybe hobbyists or smaller companies that try to ramp up manufacturing? What's that user group like?
It's a little bit of both. Because we get a lot of the traffic to Kraft Cloud from All3DP, we get both audiences. We get a lot of people who want to 3D print a couple of pieces, up to people, entrepreneurs maybe, who want to 3D print a prototype, all the way up to people who want to do mass production. So all of the partners we have all over the world, they can handle pretty much anything.
Super cool. So that brings me into a bit of a different topic. I do want to touch on contract manufacturers a bit later on again. But before we go there, you mentioned in your intro that you started out mainly with hobbyists and desktop consumer 3D printing as a target group. But also, over time, you realized that the professional additive manufacturing workspace had a demand for an outlet, and that's when you started your pro section. Tell us a little bit about how that transition happens for users. Somebody who has a 3D printer in their garage and then tries to implement that technology into their workplace. Do you have some stories or examples from readers that have gone through that transition?
Yeah. They've gone through it in a couple of different ways. One story I'm working on now is a manufacturing technician working on the floor of a major automaker. He wasn't an engineer, but he 3D printed at home. And he knew that the products or the materials he was using at home wouldn't work, but he learned about other materials, and especially carbon fiber infused nylon. And he thought we could probably 3D print a lot of these parts. We could print them lighter, which was their main focus. They needed tools and jigs and fixtures that were lighter for people like him to use on a daily basis. And so he went to his supervisor and he sold them on an idea. And of course, being a large auto manufacturer, it took actually several years for them to print the parts they wanted, have them tested, figure out which parts could be printed, make sure that they were the quality and the reliability and the consistency that they needed. And after they got through with that program, they decided to implement a lot of these parts, and a lot of them saved in wear and tear, they saved cost, time, efficiency, and he went on to win an award and got promoted to the head of the 3D printing initiative at his company, and it might be rolled out to these auto manufacturing facilities all over the world. So it's one of those, and they all lived happily ever after stories.
Yeah, it surely is. That's awesome. I've heard of similar stories also from some of our podcast guests before. One of them, the 3D printing, I'm sure you know,
Sure.
Joel. He's been on the show and is, of course, one of also those advocates for not only hobbyists to bring additive into their workplace, but also vice versa, for additive manufacturing professionals to bring additive manufacturing into their home and try to figure out how can I use additive at home and also teach my kids. I think there's some really awesome stories there as well. What type of resources can help somebody who is a professional at home but wants to become a professional in the industrial space? How can they get, from your perspective and your experience, how can they educate themselves better on the industrial scale?
Well, of course, I'd recommend all of our articles at All3DP. We cover all the technologies and all the materials, and what we really like to focus on are the case studies, are the personal stories of someone who had a problem. They decided that 3D printing was the solution to that problem, and how they went about solving it, especially with some of the failures, some of the materials that didn't work, some of the machines that maybe didn't work. I think the lessons learned are the best way to get a handle on what might work in your situation. I think there's a lot of great resources online. There's also a lot of things I'd caution people against. Do not go to ChatGPT if you want to learn about what binder jetting is. It might not give you the right answer. So I think knowing about some of the resources that you have out there, of course, All3DP, Additive Manufacturing Magazine, there are other trade magazines that have been around a while that have great use cases and descriptions from experts in the field. I think that's the best way.
Oh, for sure. And I think you have to become a fan of the industrial space as well to follow the industry, because as there are new innovative technologies and innovations coming up almost daily in the consumer space, so are they coming up in the industrial space. And I do think you need to stay on top of it. But we do need more advocates for additive manufacturing out there in the small and medium enterprises. I think the big manufacturers in the S&P mainly have at least understood the potential of additive. Not all of them, but a good chunk. But I think we now need to trickle that down into the suppliers, into the smaller organizations that can really leverage additive to its fullest potential.
Exactly, and I think that's where our mix of consumer and pro focuses on a lot, because what we've seen also, people introducing additive manufacturing into the workplace wasn't their workplace, it's taking additive manufacturing and making a business out of it. There's so many people who have designed something at home, and then they decided that they could print this. They could print some for friends and family, and then they've decided to print and sell things on Amazon or sell things on Etsy. And I think these are the companies where we're seeing the most growth. We're seeing so many smaller organizations, companies that went from a garage, they went from a small print farm, and now they're going to an even larger print farm for toys, for tools, for all sorts of products that they've designed themselves. And they found that they now have the means for the manufacturing within their reach, whereas injection molding was not within reach for most people. But I think it's the smaller entrepreneur where we're going to see so much of the growth and so much of the demand.
That is really good to hear. And I think that's the next frontier of additive. We started with key aviation and medical companies adopting additive. Then we had a big pull of the space industry and even automotive, even earlier on from prototyping perspective. Now we see defense applications being a huge driver of additive manufacturing growth. But that whole bottom piece of entrepreneurs, small companies, if they can find a way to leverage the technology at a similar level, I think we still have a lot of upsides in additive ahead of us.
Definitely.
So you mentioned you guys also have a sister company that is Kraft Cloud, and that focuses on, I don't want to say democratizing, but really increasing the access to contract manufacturers and manufacturers out there for companies or individuals that don't, initially at least, want to insource the manufacturing process. From your experience, how do you make that decision? Insourcing versus outsourcing? When do I transition from one to the other? What have you seen out there from companies that either you've written case studies on or you've seen through the lens of a contract manufacturer?
We've written a lot about contract manufacturing and the whole 3D printing services space. What we've done in our editorial coverage is upload models to, say, 8 or 10 different manufacturers and see what they come back with. How much is this part going to be at XYZ manufacturing company? What materials do they have? What technologies do they have? So if someone wanted an SLS part, they wanted just one prototype, where's the best place to get it? And so from that, we've gotten a lot of insights into what is out there and which companies are catering to which people. And you have a tier system where a lot of the contract manufacturers, the Xometries of the world, the Proto Labs, they are really focusing more on the companies and the corporations, the people who want to print 5,000, 10,000 parts. And it's divided now between the smaller companies that will 3D print one part or two parts. They have no minimums. And there is an interesting growth in the number of companies that are small additive manufacturing services. And so people can get 3 prototypes and spend $20. Whereas before that was not at all accessible through some of these larger manufacturers. And some of the customers, or some of the readers we have on All3DP, they really just want 5 vases for a Christmas present. And that's something they could get at a certain manufacturer, whereas our other readers might want 10 titanium prototypes. And there's a different set of manufacturers who cater to that audience. So I think there really is a growth and a variety that we haven't seen before in the 3D printing services space.
That's really interesting. While you were speaking, something dawned on me, which is for 5 years ago, I think in additive, we almost committed a bit of a misconception that in 3D printing one part costs the same amount as printing 1,000 parts per piece. And in reality, it's actually not true, especially if you are going to contract manufacturers, right? There is also an economy of scale. If you bring a contract of 10,000 pieces and somebody can run a machine continuously for weeks or months with one product, you will have a lower cost per part versus a one-off piece. But it seems to me that difference is starting to shrink from what you're saying, where that multiple between 10,000 and 1 might not be as much as it used to be, and then therefore also reduces the barrier of entry into additive manufacturing, especially when going to contract manufacturers. Why do you think that is? Is that because demand's a bit lower? Is that because the technology allows for a bit more flexibility? What's the reason for that trend?
I think we've seen a lot more people get into 3D printing as a service. I think people may have started with 5 or 10 printers, and then they've expanded and saying, I could make a business out of this. There's a great company in the UK we featured not too long ago, where he decided to focus on 3D printing auto parts for supercars, for these very technical and very, high-end category. And so he built his own 3D printers. He started his own company. He has dozens and dozens of them, but it's very specific to his client, and that's what his service does. And I think we're having other services focus on a particular client that they want to service. And there's just so many more people thinking, I have the expertise. Maybe I do 3D print my own product and sell it. Maybe I have 12 or 15 or 20 3D printers in a garage or in a small manufacturing space, so I am going to become a 3D printing service.
Interesting. And I agree. I do see way more specialization in contract manufacturing. And there's, of course, there's also extremes in that space, right? You have the space-focused contract manufacturers that mainly do space applications, right? And then you have the guy in a garage who during COVID printed face shields and probably now found a different markets that person could serve. And there's a lot in between.
Yeah, and I don't want to give you the impression that Kraft Cloud has people 3D printing in the garage. We have vetted quality standards and customer reviews of all of our manufacturing partners. So there is quite a variety of printing services out there, and I think people should be a little weary and try to find a reputable manufacturer, someone with reviews, someone with sample prints, because you don't know what the environment can be out there.
100%, as in any industry. Okay, so All3DP is a global platform, but if I remember correctly, the majority of your readers are in the US. Is that correct?
Yeah, the majority of our readers are in the US. The platform is in 5 languages, and then I guess the second after the US would be Europe and then Asia.
Okay. Do you see a difference between your readers in the US versus in Europe on interest, trending topics, or is additive, whether it's in Europe or it's in the US or in the APAC region?
That's a good question. I don't think we see a lot of difference. We saw a lot of glee from Europeans who weren't affected by tariffs and could get their bamboo labs a lot cheaper than in the US. 3D printed guns are not the issue, obviously, in Europe that they are in the US. But mostly, we are seeing the same trends, the same need for basic understanding of the different technologies, a lot of focus on affordability, whether that is consumer or professional, a lot of focus on engineering grade polymers. We're getting a lot of interest in all of our articles on carbon fiber, 3D printing, and some of the other Ultim and some of the other materials where people seem to be graduating up from maybe the materials they started with.
Okay, interesting. So do you still, if you look at all your articles you wrote in the last year, are the most trending articles the ones that talk about more entry-level content for additive? Or do you see your readers transitioning more and more into the depth of additive? The material science of laser powder bed fusion, or adhesion within different layers of a FDM printer? What's the trend there, just from the maturity of your users?
I'd say it runs the gamut, but how we're not a trade magazine in our editorial coverage for additive manufacturing is that we really don't cover research. We don't cover what a lab is doing somewhere. Our focus is really on how can you use additive today? What materials are available today, and how can you benefit from it? How can you grow your business through using additive? So to that end, a lot of our most popular articles are on understanding the technologies in depth so that you could make a decision on whether or not you want to buy a machine, whether or not you want to go with a service, what type of machine or technology you want to go with. We track all of our coverage in real time. And let's see, the most popular article right at this moment, we have 975 people reading on the site right now. Our homepage is always the most popular. After that, and this is a mix of our consumer and pro coverage, our 50 cool things to 3D print is the most popular. It is the 50 useful things to 3D print. And we update that.
What's the most useful thing to 3D print? Now I'm curious.
I would have to look at the article. Let me open it up. The top one is a phone lantern. It is an adorable little lantern that sits on top of the flashlight on your phone and turns it into a lantern. And it's available at Printables. And then we have...
Okay. So you can... Yeah. Do you guys then link to either a file that I can print or a supplier where I can source it from?
Yeah, absolutely. We link right to the file where you can download it. We never really feature anything you have to pay for. So it is all free stuff. That's one of our most popular things. On our pro side, right now, we just wrote about what's new in Fusion 360, or Fusion. They changed the name. We just did an update to the 3MF file format and some of the changes that went with that and why everyone should be using it. We did an article recently that's really popular. 2,000 people read it last week. It's on 3D printing transparency, how to get true transparency, whether you're using a service or doing it on your own. What materials are the most transparent? And if you were to go to a service, what do you order? A lot of companies, instead of transparent resin, they will have the brand name of it, the Stratasys Vario or something similar to that. And it can be hard for people to really navigate their way through some of the services to find the parts they need with the properties they need.
Interesting. Okay. Also interesting because we'll have Alex Oster on the show in a few weeks from Autodesk. So I think we're hitting a timely topic on that one as well. So really good to hear that is trending right now. You briefly mentioned tariffs and we jumped over that. We talked about tariffs a lot already in the past 5 episodes on this show, but they are changing so rapidly that I also not talk about it. So you've done the opposite move that I did. You moved from the US from Chicago to Munich. I moved from Munich to the US, to Austin. And therefore, I think we have an interesting view on the European region, but also the US region. Now, just what day is it? This week, Trump announced a deal with China and reduced tariffs down to 30%, at least for a 90-day period. Last week, Friday, there was a deal announced with the UK that reduces tariffs down to 10%, but still there's a 10% tariff in place. So ultimately, there's different lenses you can view all of these developments through, right? One is it hurts the economy, it hurts relationships between Europe and the US, but there's also a lot of voices that say maybe it actually helps additive because the uncertainty that kind of started with COVID and the supply chain challenges that we saw there. Then we saw the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, again, supply chain, and now we have somewhat of a trade war that really, again, creates a lot of uncertainty in where I source my parts and where the departments of defense of various countries always focus on local manufacturing. I could see a world where also large companies focus on local manufacturing, at least for critical components. And that's where additive can come into play and could benefit from all these challenges at the moment. Long intro to a question, but that's like my point of view at the moment, that there is some potential light. But maybe what's your point of view on where are we when it comes to tariffs and how does that impact additive manufacturing today and maybe in the future?
I think it's really hard to tell. I think I wrote an article for Forbes. I have a column there on additive manufacturing, and I think it was back in the fall, I ran around Formnext talking to everyone I could at Stratasys and Mark Forged and trying to ask them, what do you think tariffs could do? And the angle was really this idea of bringing manufacturing back home, reshoring manufacturing. And everyone said it could be great, right? Because everyone will buy armies of additive manufacturing. It's the fastest type of manufacturing to get up and running. You can put it anywhere. And we didn't see any of that. I don't really think we saw any of that. Not in the last several months. And I think because it's so unpredictable, the tariffs are up, the tariffs are down, whether people will invest in traditional manufacturing in the US or additive manufacturing in the US, I think they're asking themselves the same question. Is this a permanent? Is this temporary? But I think we did see a bit of an uptick in 3D printing services. At Kraft Cloud, we saw a lot more people looking at where can I get this thing 3D printed? This is the part I need. Where can I get it? And with our additive manufacturing partners, we added a new feature on the local price, where we'd give you the best price, and then with where you are, we'd give you the local price, and then we would give you the people who could produce it closest to you. And we did see an uptick in people, especially in the US, who said, okay, the price might be a little bit higher, but I definitely want it manufactured here in the US. And we saw a little bit of that in Europe, but not as much. And so I think people were looking at services as a bridge to the parts that they couldn't get from Asia, especially in the US. Whether that will stay or not, I think the whole uncertainty, like you mentioned, just put a stop on everyone's decision making. I think it's just a standstill.
Yeah, for sure. But that's really interesting to hear, because that's an early indicator, right? If we see contract manufacturer business go up, especially from local companies, that means that additive is a tool to circumvent any supply chain challenge, may it be driven by tariffs or by natural disasters or by terrorist attacks. Right?
Exactly.
And it's a really good early indicator.
It always has been. It always has been the solution to tariffs or to bridge manufacturing or to, during COVID anyway, the supply chain disruptions. And I think we saw a bump in it during COVID, and then now I think we see another interest where people are going and saying, okay, where can I get a new mold made in the US? How can I get that made in the US? And I think we've seen a lot of additive manufacturers themselves, Endeavor 3D, doing a lot of marketing online to promote the fact that you can get these things made in the US and you can get tools and the things you might have gotten made in China more locally.
Interesting. Focusing on Europe for a second, it has changed there too in the last few months, especially driven out of Germany, a new government in place, a government that has also announced a big focus on defense together with close allies in Europe. How do you see that market evolving? I think the European additive markets used to be the strongest driver, really, of additive manufacturing adoption. I think today the US is it's probably the main driver of additive manufacturing growth. At least in the industrial space, maybe different in Hobbyist, right, where the bamboo labs see major growth. What's happening in Europe? Is the defense spending going to reinvigorate growth in additive manufacturing? Are there other hurdles or opportunities that you see to reinvigorate some fire in manufacturing and in additive manufacturing?
I think what I've been seeing lately, just in the news coverage and the coverage we've been doing, is a strong focus on military. I think the US is way ahead of Europe when it comes to applying additive manufacturing in military applications. I think the economy here is still putting a halt on major investment as far as industrial additive manufacturing goes. I think we are seeing a lot more Chinese manufacturers wanting to tackle the European market, whereas they may have had their sights set on the US, but they're shifting a bit, thinking how can we sell to the European market, so we might get a lot more competition when it comes to large additive manufacturing printer makers anyway in Europe. Yeah, I think it really is just economy focused and based on whether or when that's going to turn.
Do you see it as a threat that you see a lot of Chinese manufactured also pushing into the European space, where Europe is, I would say, still today the leader in building machinery, building advanced equipment, right? From semiconductor with ASML to higher precision machinery with Trump to additive manufacturing with right EOS and SLM and initially concept laser, and now you see really low cost pressure also from Chinese manufacturers on the industrial scale. Do you think that is an opportunity for Europe to enhance their capacity in manufacturing, maybe at a lower capex investment? Or do you see it as a long term threat where a lot of these European manufacturers have a lot of competition in their core business?
I think if you look at what Bamboo Lab did to the consumer market, I think it changed the consumer market dramatically, but it introduced a lot more people to 3D printing. I think the ease of
Mm-hmm.
use and the price point grew the market in general. And I think if we had a lower price point, and it's not necessarily that the Chinese manufacturers are a lower price point, but if we had more competition and we had more accessibility, I think it would drive adoption across the industry. I think there'd be more people going after more different markets. Everyone is talking about in the industry focusing on the application and how 3D printer makers want to approach companies where they can help them with a particular application. And I think if there's just more manufacturers approaching more companies with these targeted applications, it will just grow the applications in general.
Gotcha. Okay, so focus less on the equipment and more on the end application, which was going to drive economic growth in the end. No, it's an interesting point. Okay, now to some more fun stuff. You write a lot of articles, you hear a lot of stories from individuals, from companies that either changed their own destiny through additive manufacturing or others. What have been some of your favorite stories that you told or heard in the additive manufacturing space?
I love talking to people who have taken additive manufacturing and just fell in love with it, really. A couple weeks ago, I think I did an article about 3D printed jewelry with Maeve Gillies. She used platinum to create pieces that had a Celtic design that looked
Mm.
really outstanding. And talking to her about it, you could see the passion in her face about how she could do something that no one has ever done before with this material, with the design she custom made in order to be 3D printed. I mean, it was direct selective laser sintering of the platinum. And it's those stories where people have really almost surprised themselves with how things have turned out. There's a lot. Oh, I talked to a guy at the Vicala. They're doing 3D printed body armor. And he didn't set out to
Mm.
3D print the body armor. He was just looking for a lighter weight solution to personal body armor. And it turned out that a polymer material with a particular design of these interconnected lattice parts was the best solution. And that's another story where I love where they just happened upon 3D printing as the best solution. They weren't trying to 3D print something because they could 3D print it. Those are always the ones I really like. I love following companies like Victus, using the carbon 3D for the padding of the NFL helmets every year. They're making, they're breaking new ground with what they can achieve there. Gosh, I talked to the Meckler of Sweden. They do 3D. They don't 3D print their kayaks yet, but they want to 3D print their kayaks. But they 3D print all of the full-size prototypes of their kayaks, and they
Mm.
use
Wow.
a sustainable material that they can chop up and 3D print again. And I thought that story was just a great idea and a great example of prototyping, but approaching prototyping in a sustainable way.
What about last time we spoke, you talked about a guy in the US, was it in Philly or somewhere, who has a custom motorcycle shop, or actually restores vintage motorcycles, and has now a industrial grade metal printer in his shop and prints parts.
Yeah, I really like that story because it just showed how metal 3D printing can be accessible. That someone
Yeah.
who restores vintage motorcycles can learn how to use the 3D printer, that it is not this big scary piece of machinery. He has one in the back room of his motorcycle shop, and he 3D prints actual parts that you can't get for a 1940s Harley Davidson. And his business is growing, and he's actually redesigning some of these parts and making them better than the original. The more efficient, lighter weight. And so he's not only able to restore these machines that he has this passion for, but he's able to make them better. And I think that just shows how you can become invested in the technology to not only just serve a purpose, but to actually make something better than it was. And really, I don't know, just the business he's making from this, it just allows him to just follow his dream of doing this, where previously the parts would just take months to forge or to cast, and it just wasn't a type of business that could grow.
Yeah, it's kind of a beautiful additive story to also end this episode. I think if we see more people like that person who has a probably a one man show, a super small company in additive, can help him to increase profitability and speed to market and restore some of these old vehicles. And I think we're on a really good path for adoption and also for impact in various other industries. Carolyn, it was awesome to have you on the show. Like I mentioned in my intro, I was excited for this conversation because I think you bring a really interesting angle, not only from a consumer perspective, but also from a larger market perspective. So I really enjoyed our conversation today. Thanks for being on the
Great.
show.
Thanks for having me. It was great.
And yeah, if you enjoyed this episode out there, share it, like it, give it a review on your favorite podcast platform. Also, of course, check out all3dp.com and follow that page. A lot of awesome stories and articles that are inspiring, whether you're in the industrial space or in the consumer space. This was the Additive Snack Podcast. I'm your host, Fabian Alefeld, and I will see you next time.